How's everybody doing this morning? That was pretty good. That was like mid-season form for my undergraduate classes. Let's try that again. How's everybody doing this morning? Much better. All right. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about change, about how to help organizations to change. And it turns out that organizations don't change, people change. And those organizations are made up of people, which means that when you want to make a change in your organization, or perhaps more importantly, many of your projects actually involve coordination across a bunch of different organizations, you are not just trying to change organizations, you are trying to change the behavior of people. And all of you deep down understand how hard it is to change behavior because you yourselves have tried it. So first of all, by show of hands, how many of you have ever made a New Year's resolution? How many of you have had a New Year's resolution fail? How many of you have given up making New Year's resolutions because they never work? So we understand exactly how hard it is to make changes in our own behavior, and yet, when we get to the point where we are trying to influence the behavior of other people, we switch from all of the hard work that we do to change our own behavior to messaging. We think to ourselves, if I could only come up with the right message, people would listen and immediately change their behavior. And I want to help to get rid of that belief with just a quick example. If you look at the Judeo-Christian heritage that many people in the United States share, you will find that there is a top 10 list buried in that is called the 10 Commandments. Now, if you excise a couple of those commandments that have to do with follow this religion rather than that one, it is actually a prescription for behavior. It says, do the thing that is right in the long term rather than the thing that is right in the short term. So that person who just annoyed you, don't kill him. That very pretty thing somebody else owns, don't steal it. That very attractive person living next door to you who's married to your neighbor, leave him or her alone. All of those things are on that list because they are hard, not because they are easy. And according to the legend that surrounds the 10 Commandments, God, an omnipotent, omniscient deity, came down, gave these commandments to humanity in the best-selling book of all time. And this list is a failure because humanity does every single thing that's on that list. And so I'm here to tell you now that if God cannot come down and tell people to do something and have them listen, what makes anyone else in this room think that all they have to do is tell something to someone and that is going to change their behavior? That is not it. If you want to have an influence on other people's behavior, you need to understand a little bit about what it is that drives people's behavior. And what drives people's behavior fundamentally is the human motivational system. And I could give a whole lecture on this, but I'm just going to highlight 3 points about motivation. Number one, it engages people's goals. So fundamentally, we have to understand what people's goals are. When it engages people's goals, it is giving energy to those goals, and it gives energy to those goals by highlighting a discrepancy between where you are right now and where you'd like to be in the future. People engage their goals because they are dissatisfied with something in the present that they are trying to change about the future, and they have to have a set of actions that they can perform that will enable them to make the change that they desire. Because if you highlight a discrepancy and there's nothing people can do about it, all they do is get frustrated. And if you want to understand that viscerally, just think about what's happened the last time you were sitting in traffic. You're sitting in traffic and there is literally a discrepancy between where you are right now and where you'd like to be, and there's nothing you can do about it, and so all you do is make splendid gestures at the cars around you. So we need to create opportunities for people to engage those goals by highlighting discrepancies between present and future, and then give people a plan that will enable them to carry out that goal. And there's one last thing I need to add about the motivational system, and then we can figure out how can we influence people's behavior. And that is that we need to remember that people are strongly driven by goals that are right in front of them, by short-term goals rather than long-term goals. That is why in daily life, that piece of cake is more important to us than what our body is going to look like 5 years from now. Why that sports car seems more important than our kids' college education. In order to achieve long-term goals, we need to actually create goals that people can achieve in the present that will enable them to create specific actions that lead to long-term desirable behaviors. This is fundamentally what change in organizations is all about, is engaging the motivational systems of the people who we work with in order to ensure that they will take actions each day whose accumulated influence leads to the desired outcome in the long term. That's what we're trying to achieve. So how are we going to get there? The first thing we need to do is to remember that when we create opportunities for change, we are trying to create opportunities for what I like to call bridgeable gaps. A bridgeable gap says that we are trying to help people to understand that discrepancy between where they are right now and where they're going to be in the future. And then that creates the gap. And then we want to have a plan, a specific plan that refers to particular actions that people can take in the present that will bridge that gap. And let me break this down a little bit. First, let's start with the gap. It turns out that psychologically there are two kinds of gaps. There are what are called approach gaps, where you help people to find some desirable outcome in the future that they would like to achieve. And then you highlight the fact that if they work towards something, they could have some wonderful, beautiful, desirable thing. And then we have avoidance gaps. And avoidance gaps tell you that there's some dangerous, noxious, or terrible thing in the present. And if I don't act, then this terrible thing will persist. And so I'm trying to avoid a negative outcome. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here. Because in the short term, if I want to make sure that you're going to do something, the best thing I can do is to create an avoidance gap, to tell you that there's some tragedy, some calamity, some terrible thing that's about to happen, so you'd better act now. We often do this with our kids. So help me, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to tell your mother. And so we threaten in the short term, because that gets people to do something immediately. Unfortunately, from an emotional standpoint, when you create these avoidance gaps, the emotions that we experience are stress, fear, and anxiety. So I can get you to move, but the price I pay is that I get you stressed out, I get you fearful. How many of you enjoy stress? No, not so much. And so here's the problem. In the short term, I can get you to do something by highlighting what will go wrong if you don't do the right thing. But the risk of that is I create high levels of stress and anxiety, and people start just trying to avoid that. And they avoid that by not coming to work. They avoid that by ignoring the things that you're telling them. Now, every once in a while, of course, there are important, dangerous things that are out there. Stephen highlighted the fact that there was an uptick in the number of fatalities, that there is a steady number of accidents that are happening on work sites. Those are physically dangerous things that happen on work sites, and people do need to be vigilant about those. So it's not that we can ignore those avoidance gaps, but we need to find a way when we're creating change in our organizations to do more than just highlight what can go wrong. We need to help people to see the wonderful, beautiful, and desirable things that they can achieve as part of their work. People are engaged in the workplace when they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And many of you work on projects that when they're completed are big. I mean, they're big physically, but they're also big in a societal standpoint. Many of you have worked on projects that if you drive by them later, you can feel justifiably good about those. Either because you have helped to construct a building that matters or because you have helped to construct something that drives an economy. You can feel good about that. The people who work for you need to share in that pride. We need to give them opportunities to see that when a project is brought in safely and under budget and on time, that they are doing something that contributes in a positive way to economies and to what people are trying to do to make a living. We need to give them an opportunity to experience those positive feelings that are part of making a change in an organization. And so we want people to find some number of these approach gaps. Now, the gap alone only creates energy. We know from physics, right? Energy without direction is heat. It is energy with direction that is work. The way we create direction is by giving people a specific plan that takes into account the obstacles people will face if we want them to make a change in behavior. That is called an implementation intention. We need to give people an opportunity to create implementation intentions. We need them to think about what are the specific actions that they need to take in order to achieve the goals that they want to pursue. If you tell a contractor, I need you to bring this project in on budget, well, that's a very high-level goal, but it doesn't tell anyone how to do it. They need to be thinking specifically about what are the actions I'm taking? How is this going to happen? Because unless you think about the specific actions, it is not clear what things people are doing day to day. And because once you start thinking about the specific actions, that is when you begin to notice all of the conflicts. When you treat things abstractly, you miss the conflicts. There is an important theory in psychology called construal level theory, from the word to construe. It says that the more distant you are from something in time or space or socially, the more abstractly you think about it. So when you have a big planning meeting at the front end of a project, there is a tendency to think too abstractly about the work that you're doing. And it leads to something that is similar to what you all probably experienced about a day and a half ago. So how many of you signed up to come here to CII several months ago? And you were excited. It was in San Diego. It's CII. I'm going to see my colleagues. How many of you got up the other morning and said, why in the world did I sign up for this? I don't have the time for this. I'm too busy. Did you not know 6 months ago that you were going to be busy today? You're going to be as busy today as you were every other day of the year. You knew this was going to happen, but 6 months ago you weren't thinking about it because you were treating August 6th abstractly. Then on August 5th, August 6th didn't seem so abstract anymore, and all you could think about was all the specific things you need to do. When you are trying to create the bridgeable gap, you need to bring the entire team up close to the project and have them think about all of the details, all of the things that are going to be on the calendar on that day in order to deal with all of the obstacles that are going to come up that would block you making a change in behavior. We need to create bridgeable gaps. So once we've created this bridgeable gap, we're not done. There are several barriers to change. One of those barriers to change is something that's called change fatigue. One of the problems that organizations have is that they're constantly implementing new processes, some more than others. Some organizations never want to change, but some of them like to embrace each new fad. They went from Six Sigma to Agile to the next thing. And part of the problem there is that then some new manager stands up and says, this year we're going to change and do things better. And everyone else sits there and goes, oh no, here we go again. Now what I told you earlier was that the motivational system likes to do what is easiest to do in the short term, what is most desirable to do in the short term, rather than the thing that's desirable in the long term. When you get up in front of the group and say, we're about to make a change, if you are part of an organization that has routinely tried to make changes in the past and they haven't quite worked out or they haven't quite been implemented as they should have been, then you are facing something in which most people feel the most expedient thing they can do is duck their head and wait for this to go away. So you have to fight against people's tendency to figure that they can outlast you. So you have to think about what is it that you are going to ask people to do in the short term that will be more desirable than just sitting and waiting for the future. The future is here, that's the theme. If we're going to create change in the future, we have to help people to understand when we are serious about making a change. And that's one of the reasons that we want to have a very specific plan to roll out. Because if I just say something very vague, like this year we're going to do more with less, this year we're going to be more efficient, this year we're going to bring our projects in a safer way, whatever grand general statement we make, if it is not followed up with specific statements about what you're going to do in the future, people are going to start to ignore it. And the reason for that is related to something that happens in movies a lot. If you watch movies, there are some movies that are really good at showing you the action. And then there are some movies that are really poorly designed in which they realize they have plot holes, and so they use lots of voiceover to fill in the gaps, where they tell you what's happening rather than show you what's happening. When you are trying to implement change in an organization, you have to show people the change. You have to be that change rather than telling people about the change. And so the reason you want to engage with people to come up with specific actions that they can take is that it demonstrates your commitment to the change. The more committed you are, the more effort you have put in to help people to see the specific actions that they need to take, the more that they will come along with you for two reasons. One, because human beings are inherently a social species. We have dominated planet Earth, not because of our fearsome physical presence, but because of our ability to work together. After all, here I'm a faculty member at the University of Texas. If I were to take my favorite middle linebacker on the University of Texas football team and put him up against a bear, not a Baylor bear, I mean a bear, not a Chicago bear, I mean a bear, the bear wins every time. Bears are fearsome physical creatures. We dominate planet Earth because we can work together, because we can cooperate, because we can coordinate our actions. And so if people see you engaging in the process of really planning out the future, they will want to jump in. They will want to jump in part through a process called goal contagion. When we see other people doing something in the world, we interpret their actions by watching what they do and imagining what would we be doing if we were performing those actions. And when we interpret that, part of what we do is to engage that goal ourselves, and that actually makes us want to do the same thing. So you need to be the physical example of what it is that you are trying to achieve in your organization, because when you do that in a visible way, other people will follow along with you just through goal contagion. There is, in fact, a more general principle here, which is that if you say that there's something that you want as a change in your organization, as a change in a project that coordinates multiple groups, you have to remember a very simple principle. There is what you say, what you do, what you reward, and the people who are listening to you are listening in reverse order. What you say is least important. What you are doing matters more. What is being rewarded matters most. People are paying attention to what is being rewarded and what people are doing. So if you want to create successful change, part of what that means is you need to be visibly directing that change, engaging in that change, not just saying it, doing it, because your physical presence is alerting people that this is what's important. It is so important that you yourself are doing it. On top of that, you need to reward people who are engaging in exactly the behaviors that you think are important, because everyone in an organization is paying attention to the rewards. Rewards are praise or punishment. Rewards are access to opportunity. Rewards are promotions. Rewards are increases in salary. All of those things are rewards, so not everything has to be financial. Just calling someone else out and telling them that they did a good job can be a significant reward for people, particularly early in their career when they want to be noticed by people in leadership positions. Everyone is paying attention to who's being rewarded. If you are not systematically rewarding the people who are engaging in the changes that you want to see, you are missing out on a crucial opportunity to get people to go along with the changes that you are trying to implement. Generally speaking, if you say that there's something you want and the people that you are working with are not systematically doing what you want, what that tells you is there is a misalignment between what you're saying, what people are visibly doing, and what's being rewarded. And you need to analyze those things within the organization and within the global project to ensure that there is alignment between what you say, what people are visibly doing, and what's being rewarded. You need to diagnose that and make sure that all of those things are aligned. Another thing that's important when it comes to change is that you have to remember that you are fighting against people's habits. The people who work on your projects have habits that they have used their entire careers that drive most of their actions. You may not realize how much your life is driven by habits, though you may have recognized it just this morning. So how many of you stayed last night at this hotel or one nearby? How many of you live at this hotel or one nearby? None of you. Okay, so that means that this morning when you woke up, your routine that you normally do did not work. Normally, you wake up at home. You are able to go through your entire morning routine, getting yourself washed and dressed and ready for work without really having to think about it, so that you can plan your day, think about other things that are more important to you. And when you woke up here this morning, none of that worked. You had to think about, where are my clothes? You had to think about, how do I get the water from the bottom to the top of the shower? Because there's a virtually limitless number of ways that can be done. You had to pay attention to every single aspect of that morning routine, and it wasn't pleasant, because the whole point of having habits is to take the daily issues that we don't want to have to think about, compile them away, and turn them into memories, so that we are faster to remember what we're supposed to do than we are to think about what we're supposed to do. People do not like to have their habits disrupted. And that means that when you are implementing change, you need to empathize a little bit with the people whose lives you are disrupting. It is really useful up front to tell everybody, I understand this is not always going to be pleasant. I understand I am asking you to do something that will disrupt what you normally do, that will make you think about things that you normally don't have to think about. And it's important in big projects like the ones that you do to recognize that for many of the people whose lives you are disrupting, it is not the least bit obvious to them why they have to do things differently than they've been doing them in the past, because what they did in the past seemed to have worked fine before. Often you are making people do something differently because of the downstream consequences of their doing it differently for other people working on the project. It is useful to help people to understand, I realize that you might think what you were doing before is perfectly adequate. The reason I'm asking you to make a change is because it's going to make other people's lives easier, and that's going to make the project better, faster, safer. Let people know why it is that you are disrupting their lives. Make people understand why you are asking them to do things that they are not going to like. And remind people that when you make a change, that when the change is first implemented, it's not going to be fun. And the reason you want to do that is because emotion is kind of a funny thing. Emotions are created from that motivational system that I told you about earlier. When things are going motivationally well for you, you feel good. When things are going motivationally bad for you, you feel bad. But you're not always sure why. Sometimes things aren't going quite well, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is that's driving that. And so, for example, you implement this new change in the organization. Everyone feels mildly unsettled. They're unsettled because the habits that they had are not working. It's the same thing as if you've ever moved to a new office, like your whole team has moved to an office, and for 6 weeks everybody's crabby because nobody knows where to throw things away or where to find file cabinets or where to find new paper or where the copy machine is. All those little things are annoying. And so you snap at each other, and then eventually you kind of ease into it. When you make a change, everyone's a little annoyed, everyone's a little bit on edge, and they look around the world and they try to figure out, why is this that this is bothering me? And then they figure it out. It's that change that did it. This change is silly, stupid, pick your favorite word for it. And so they blame the change. So what you need to do is to tell people, we are about to disrupt your habits. It's not going to be pleasant for a while. That's perfectly normal. It's like the pilot getting on to tell you there's going to be a little turbulence. Relax. That's the way planes work. You want to tell people, relax, there's going to be some turbulence. That's the way change works. It's going to be okay. Don't blame the new system for at least 3 months. And chances are, if you have created a good system, after 3 months, that new system will be people's habits. They will have forgotten that they were upset about this. They won't blame the change, and you'll be able to move forward. After 3 months, though, if there are still persistent problems, now they can come back to you and say, you know what, I gave this a shot. Here are the things that don't seem to be working. And now you want to be responsive to that. Because I promise you, no plan that you create will be perfect. There will be flaws. As they say in the military, no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy. And the same thing is true when it comes to creating projects. You plan as best you can, and then you have to adapt. If you want people to come along with the changes you are creating, you need to both get them to give you space to allow that plan to be implemented, and then you need to be responsive to the complaints that people register. After a few months, after some time has gone on and people have had the opportunity to implement that plan. Because if you are not responsive to it, then people are going to start to disengage. They're going to say, this is silly, what we were doing before worked better. So that's your responsibility, is you're going to create a little social contract with people. And that contract is, I need you to engage with this for a few months to allow the change to settle in. And then we're going to engage in a process of continual updating, continual repair of these processes to get it right. And if we do that, if we work together in that, we can create long-term changes that actually succeed. Now, another thing that we need to do is to recognize that when we're building changes, there are going to be lots of situations in which people have different goals. And so when you have lots of different groups that come together, one of the things that happens is you, particularly if you're running an overall project, you may have one set of goals. You may have other people who have other kinds of goals. And what that means is that you need to understand at a more specific level, what is it that is driving the various people in order to help to align them to the overall change you're trying to make. And one of the things that becomes important is you want to actually engage in fairly regular meetings with people who are involved in implementing the changes that you're trying to put together in your organization, in part to get their engagement. Because the thing about any distributed project like this is that if you're sitting relatively towards the top of that, you are not necessarily speaking to the people who are engaging in specific actions on specific sites. There are different layers of people in between you and them, and you need to make sure that there is alignment between all of those people, that you are clear on what people's goals are. One of the reasons for creating that alignment between what you say, what you do, and what you reward is that you want to make sure that those people who are looking to advance their careers, who are looking to be noticed, who are looking to become part of the future leadership of an organization, you want to make sure that they feel like their concerns are being heard, but also that their efforts are being noticed, because that is part of their reward structure. So we want to make sure that we are engaging with people and having continual conversations in order to help the projects that we're working on to move along as swiftly and as clearly as possible. So the last thing that I really want to talk about, and then I actually want to open this up for questions. I want to give people an opportunity to ask me things, because it turns out you don't often have an opportunity to have a psychologist standing in front of you. And so I really will answer almost any question. In fact, what I like to tell people is I will answer any question that doesn't start with, I have this friend who... But before I do this, I want to talk about two things. The first is the concept of mentorship. The thing about creating change in organizations is that people don't necessarily know how to do the next thing, because people do not come pre-programmed with very much knowledge. We are born actually not knowing much at all. We need to learn almost everything that we know how to do in our lives. I was actually reminded by this. I don't know how many of you have been to Austin, Texas. The first 15 years I lived in Austin, I lived in a neighborhood called Northwest Hills, which is overrun by deer. I had a baby deer born on my front yard. I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you before. It's a fascinating thing. The deer pops out of its mom, looks a little stunned. Within 24 hours, it has stood up and gone bounding off with its mother, and within a year, it is a fine, upstanding member of the deer community. I like to point this out because I have 3 children. They're in their early 20s, and they are just barely becoming productive members of society. Why is it that a baby deer can become part of its community in 1 year, and my kids required 2 decades on the dole before they could become productive members of society? And the answer is because deer are pretty stupid. They don't know how to use iPads, they can't go to the local supermarket to feed themselves, and they are really bad at crossing the street. My kids, for all of their flaws, can use iPads. My oldest son sells product placements in movies and television. There is no evolutionary niche that would have prepared a human being to sell product placements. But he is able to do that successfully because of his ability to learn from the people around him continually, from having to learn just how to feed himself as a child, all the way through learning how to navigate the entertainment industry in order to sell product placements. The people that we work with have to learn to do everything, and you know what? So do you. Each of us needs to learn almost everything we need to do in our jobs from somebody else, which means we need to improve the mentoring that we do and the mentoring that we get. Now, most organizations, particularly when it comes to training future managers, create mentoring programs, and the mentoring programs are often terrible. Someone gets hired, and they assign that person a mentor. And then those people go out for coffee, and they have a perfectly pleasant conversation, and they never speak again. Because that person doesn't have anything to teach the person who was assigned to be their mentee. But from there on after in the organization, you say, do you have a mentor? Yep. Do you have a mentee? Yep. When was the last time you talked? I don't know. When were they hired? What we need to do instead is to create a different system of mentoring. First of all, we need to recognize that people don't need one mentor, they need a team of mentors. As Noe mentioned in the open, I have a new book that just came out called Bring Your Brain to Work, and one of the things I do is to talk about the mentoring team that people need. We all need to have somebody we think of as a highly successful person who we just want to listen to understand how they've done what they do. But we also want to find people who have specific skills that we think we need that we haven't mastered yet, and we need them to coach us through it. There is a big difference between a coach and an advisor. When you go to an advisor, you say, what do I do? And the advisor tells you. But if you're think about sports, for example. When a player asks a coach something about free throw shooting, the coach doesn't get out and shoot the free throw for the player. The coach teaches the player how to shoot the free throw. We need that kind of coaching on the job, in which somebody comes to us and asks for help, and we walk them through the process of how to solve that problem so that they hear our voices in their head as they move forward, and we need the same thing. If the future is here and we're not necessarily prepared for it, we need to find mentors who will help us to navigate that future. But if we're sitting sort of towards the top of the food chain of many of our organizations, we don't necessarily have other people in those organizations who are going to help us to learn what we need to learn. So where are we going to find it? Turns out this year you're going to find it in San Diego, right here. If you want to get the most out of this conference, then I urge all of you to create, we're going to tie this all together, an implementation intention to find a mentor. So here's what I want you to do. When I'm done speaking, I want each of you to take out a sheet of paper or maybe your phone if you're not tweeting this live already. I want you to take out something and write down 2 big questions, 2 big problems that you're struggling with in your workplace that are going to require a change or a new skill. What are 2 things that you don't know how to do as well as you could know how to do? All of us have something. I want you to think of 2 of those things. And then as you're walking around, keeping those in mind, I want you to be listening to conversations people are having where somebody might actually mention something that relates to one of those questions. Or perhaps if you are one of the people who raised your hand because you've come to this conference for 5 years or for 10 years, that you will now remember, wait a second, there's this person in this other organization who's actually really good at that. And I want you to take them out for coffee or a walk in front of the bay or just to stand out in the hallway and start to pick their brain a little bit and ask their permission to continue that conversation so that you can learn from them. I want each of you to create the intention of finding a mentor for yourselves at this meeting to help you with something that you find difficult to do. I also want you to do one other thing that involves a second implementation intention. I want you to think a little bit about a big problem that you think your organization is going to face over the next 12 months. And I want you to write down, I want you to look through the program on the app, And I want you to find a session that relates to that. And as Stephen pointed out, some of the sessions here are not necessarily in your specific area. Often the best place to learn about a new way of doing things is not from your vertical, but from something that someone else is doing. Get out of your comfort zone. How many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you are sitting with people you know? Many of you. Stop that. This is the last session you get to do that. From here on out, when you walk into a session, if you see somebody you know sitting at a table, like you know really well, if you see them sitting at a table, wave, sit at another table. Otherwise, you're not going to meet anybody while you're here. Okay? And you're thinking to yourself, but that's uncomfortable. Yes. We like to do the things that are best for us in the short term, not the things that are best for us in the long term. The thing that feels right to do in the short term is to sit with people you already know. I'm sitting at a table with Stephen. I can walk across campus and see him. That's not right. We should be getting to know people that we don't know already, which will be uncomfortable temporarily, but in the long term will pay significant dividends for us. And I want you to feel that discomfort of doing something that is uncomfortable for you to do in the short term, even though it's right in the long term. And the reason I want you to feel that is because that's the thing you are asking everyone in your organization to do when you're trying to make a change. If you can't get yourself to sit at a different table from people you know, what makes you think you can get anyone to do something that makes them uncomfortable? Right? I want you to experience for yourself exactly how hard it is to do something that doesn't feel quite right in the moment. But if you learn to do that, you will learn something important about getting people in your organizations to change. So here's your second implementation intention. I want you to meet new people, and I want you to listen to them talk about what they care about professionally. Because the other thing about meeting new people is it's fun to talk about where they're from and their spouses and whether they like golf. Please have those conversations as well. Get to know people on a personal level, but also find out what they're working on, what changes they're creating, what technologies they're using. Meet people from different segments of the industry so that you can make sure you're staying up to date on the latest changes across the industry, because the best ideas often involve drawing something you know from one area of expertise to another. And use this as an opportunity to create the team of mentors that you are going to need in order to drive the kinds of changes that you're trying to create. So let me just review what I talked about, then we'll give Noah a chance to feed me some questions. Remember, the human motivational system is driven by bridgeable gaps. A gap between present and future that creates energy, that has a specific plan that gets us from here to there. That when we want to create change, we need to create both the gap and the bridge. That we need to align what people say, what we're saying, with what people are visibly doing and with what's being rewarded. We need to remember that people need to learn to do this, and so we need to teach them, we need to prepare them, and we need to let them know that it's going to be uncomfortable. If we do all of those things, we stand a fighting chance of having our organizations be different when we meet again next year than they were this year. So thanks for listening to me, and Noah, take it away.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I could not stand up. I wanted to listen more. So thank you so much. That was great. And we got a few questions already. And so we'll answer a couple or maybe two or three, and then you're going to have a chance to meet him again at the CI booth during the break. So take advantage of that. So let me refresh my app here. First question is, in any implementation initiative or change, communication is critical. Why are engineers not so good at communicating? What can be done about it?
Why are engineers not so good at communicating? Well, part of the problem is if you think about what we're educated to do, most engineers, if you think of the education curriculum for engineering, were not given a lot of classes that involved public speaking or even necessarily listening to anyone else. And furthermore, I think one of the things that comes with being in the science end of things is that we tend to believe that if you're on the science and technology end of things, that information flows from us outward to the world. And it turns out communication is a two-way street. We have to listen as much as we talk. In fact, in my new book, in addition, when I talk about the various brains that people have, I talk about the jazz brain, our ability to improvise. And the first law of jazz, and I took up the saxophone in my mid-30s, and what I learned is the first law of jazz is when you sit in with a new combo, you want to listen more than you play. And that means we need to listen to what people are telling us in order to be able to communicate effectively. So what I would say is there are two big things we need to do if we want to become better communicators. The first is to really listen to what people are telling us, and then not try to explain to them why they're wrong, right, which is often an easy thing to do, but instead to really listen and think for a second, what is deeply right about what they just told me? And then start with that as you communicate with them. And then the second thing is to really remember that people need to learn to do almost everything that they're going to do. And so when we're communicating, particularly around change, we need to think of this as a process of teaching, which means we want to think about how do we want the people we're talking to be different at the end of the conversation than they were at the beginning.
Thank you, Art. One more question here is, have you seen technology help bring global mentors and mentees together, coaching remotely? Does that work?
Yeah, so a lot of us are working in organizations that are worldwide, and luckily technology can help. But technology helps primarily by trying to create what's called co-presence, which means we need to actually find opportunities to feel like we are as close as possible with people around the world as we can be, which can be hard, right? Like I have some people that I work with in Singapore. From Austin, Texas to Singapore, there's like 1 hour a day on each end that I can talk to them when we're both awake. And so, but we need to find ways to actually engage. And even simple things like Skype and Zoom can be wonderful tools to get people together. The thing about communication, particularly at a distance, is that we tend to do it via text. There's a Herb Clark, who's a psychologist who studies communication, has pointed out that human communication evolved for small numbers of people to have conversations in real time, face to face. And the further away that we get from that ideal situation, the worse communication gets. Which means that the more time that we spend only texting with people, only emailing with people, only reading threads on Slack, the more of that we do, the worse our communication gets. And particularly when it comes to mentoring, we need to have that engagement so that someone can really tell us what they're experiencing and immediately follow up on things that they didn't understand. From a distance, it's very hard to tell when somebody didn't understand something. But when you see the quizzical look on their face, it begins to give you a clue that maybe everything that you said didn't register. So really, you don't have to be in the same place at the same time, but you certainly want to use technology to create some feeling that you are synchronized.
Okay, so last question in the last few seconds here. And the question is, how do you effectively deal with the middle layer of leadership that is only tactically aligning with change?
Yeah, so middle management is like the worst job in the world because you're sandwiched in between people who you're trying to get to do something and people who are trying to get you to do something. It's hard, so if you're higher in the food chain, one of the first thing you need to do is to empathize with everybody in middle management, to recognize that they're being pulled in different directions, that they're dealing with all of the complaints that people are getting while still trying to deal with making you happy with things. This is why, as I was saying earlier, you want to have those frequent conversations with people in middle management to make sure that you understand what their concerns are and to make sure that you are actually trying to give them the benefit of your expertise in helping this change to happen. It's why you want to have specific plans. And honestly, some of the stuff that I'm teaching you today is the sort of stuff you actually want to teach them. For example, this notion of what they say, what they do, what they reward is also influencing the behavior of the people who are working for them. And so sometimes they may be saying things that no one's visibly doing, in which case they need to find ways of creating examples of people visibly doing things that they want. And they need to make sure that they are rewarding behaviors that are consistently aligned with what it is that they're trying to get. And often, even if you are thinking about that alignment, they're not constantly thinking about it. So you want to make sure that that actually moves its way all the way down the organization.
Art, thank you so much.
Thank you.